Hey guys, and welcome to my very first Zelda theory. I watch these all the time on YouTube, and I love to see how deep the fans go into the lore and history of one of, in my opinion, the best franchises ever made. The Legend of Zelda games bring so much enjoyment with adventure, dungeons, lovable characters, and a lot more with each new game. Though each game has its unique spin on what keeps them different, there is still a familiar goal to reach as the hero, reborn with the Triforce of Courage, faces off against an evil with power to save the embodiment of the goddess, who usually holds the Triforce of Wisdom. There's so much you can cover with a series that spans decades, but I'm going to go through an area with probably a lot of speculation, and an area involves the history of Breath of the Wild in the game. By this point, most Zelda fans will know the story of the Calamity, how it was thwarted thousands of years ago with the princess, her knight, and an army of mechanical beings known as guardians, with divine beasts and their champions. The second wave of this evil is presented now with two installments being portrayed in Breath of the Wild and Age of Calamity, both games I enjoy thoroughly. While diving into a timeline split and what that can mean for the series going forward, I don't want to cover something like this when we're already anticipating another installment in Breath of the Wild 2 sometime in the future, whenever that will be. Instead, I want to give a look through a kingdom 10,000 years ago with Hyrule and the gap between calamities. Now, what started this off was one night my friends and I were starting a role playing campaign, and I saw that there was something made for Legend of Zelda mechanics. This was exciting, but then we were tasked with where should we have this campaign take place? What era? And since all of us had played through Breath of the Wild, or at least were familiar, we decided to make it during the events of this installment of the game. The only problem was that there's already a lot of things happening during the games themselves, and it would feel out of place. Can you imagine? Your crew are stumbling past the Twin Peaks. All of a sudden, you are caught up in the battle at Fort Atano. Now, I know you can do so much with role playing, but I wanted something familiar, but also something maybe untouched. And so I began to research of a kingdom 10,000 years before the events of Breath of the Wild or Age of Calamity. For history covering this, it is really hard to pinpoint what exactly this kingdom looked like. Online sources and books give ideas to what this kingdom may have looked like, but Nintendo probably keeps this vague enough to keep the interest in the mystery, or to do something with it later. Who knows? But if we were to even look at world maps and how our own history has changed over just a handful of 1,000 years, kingdoms destroyed, others taking their place, can be seen in just a few hundred years. Yet, in Hyrule's case, we're talking 10,000 years. That is a lot more to consider with how much our lands have changed since the early ages we have recorded. Yet, it is fun to think about the technologies that we have and the technologies that The Legend of Zelda has. We have cars, but they can teleport. We have the internet. They have whatever Sheikah tech runs on. I have read a few theories about how the 10,000 year gap can be explained by linking the events all the way back to Skyward Sword. But the problem with that is that there's too many in game references to already having a functioning Hyrule and the ban of the Sheikah technology coming from the king at that time himself. So, with all this to consider, here are my thoughts on what I think Hyrule looked like 10,000 years ago. Feel free to like and subscribe, and also put in the comments of what you think maybe might be missing. I'm only going to be covering three big things because this is my first video and I'm already feeling overwhelmed with the amount of work that it takes to make these awesome things. So, like I said, feel free to enjoy this video and leave a like if you do. First thing to mention that I think is the biggest thing that is not set up in the Ancient Kingdom are the stables. The stables are a very unique addition to Breath of the Wild, and the Legend of Zelda games have had horse riding in previous installments, but In this open world adventuring, you can stumble upon these stables in so many different areas. The stables are brought up into much more detail in a Dr. Wily video, so for more details on the stables themselves, check it out there. But for what I'm looking at is that these nomad structures are in response to the calamity that nearly wiped out the world of Hyrule. If we were to speculate population in what we see from the ruins from the vast kingdom in Age of Calamity, then the stables are a very small portion to the survivors and the ancestors of that terrible day. For gameplay, it makes sense to have a shrine that teleports exactly to where one of the many stables are set up. None on the Great Plateau, though. But for actuality, it is highly unlikely for them to be so conveniently stationed. The reason stables are not around during the 10,000 year past kingdom is because the kingdom is expanded pretty far, in my opinion. You don't have to go too long before stumbling across some ruins or even seeing how far the kingdom stretches in Ages of Calamity, with Hyrule Castle to the Great Plateau to Fort Hateno to Akala Citadel, covering a lot of observable land. To be honest, the Highlands got wrecked during the calamity, to which the numbers are reduced to small pockets of towns and villages and these stables. This next theory builds off of the stables, but branches out a bit more. This is a stretch, but by the time Link is waking up 100 years after the calamity, the whole world has changed. But what if some things such as the great fairies were never really part of the kingdom during the 10,000 years? Some ideas that support this can come from the first theory with the stables. The stables are a functioning network that all look alike, with the god of horses. Now I'm going to probably butcher this, but Malena? Malana. Malala. I'm sorry, someone will have to correct me on that. And their buildings are resembling of this god. We find all these great fairies scattered across Hyrule in cocoons because of a lack of people coming and paying tribute. The popular thought to this is that since the calamity, there are simply not enough people to pay tribute and it's far more dangerous to go out. Yet, some evidence that shows support that the great fairies might have cocooned a while longer is the cost. The first fairy you run into only costs 100 rupees, then 500, 1,000, and then a whopping 10,000 for the fourth great fairy that you stumble across. The horse god is 1,000, regardless of who you unlock. Now, for gameplay purposes, this can be just a mechanic. But what if for some of the great fairies, their cocoon state was a whole lot longer than just the 100 years that have passed since the recent calamity? Maybe when the kingdom adopted the Sheikah tech, it put aside the spiritual power, kind of like we see in the Pixar movie, where magic is seldom used and replaced with technology. It makes you wonder how the great fairies can be drained over time. Since this is the first game that the fairies act in this manner, an Ocarina of Time, pretty much all the fairies are blocked away and you have to bomb your way only to bring them up with Zelda's lullaby. But fairies such as Cortera, close to Kakariko Village, is cocooned even though she is very close and seldom enemies in between Kakariko Village and that fairy where she is. Plus, you only usually see Link or main characters interact with great fairies. Melania might be the only great fairy who is widely known through the stables and is still weak in a cocoon state, yet Highland Stable is fairly close by. So at this point, when I get to my last point of things not appearing, the census is that 10,000 years is a long time. A whole matter of things can change. So for the last point, I'm going to mention trails and buildings, maybe excavating, that is not present 10,000 years ago. This one could be very ambiguous, as there are no way of telling just how much things can change over the amount of time. The monarchy itself has probably seen hundreds of Princess Zeldas since the one that took on Calamity Ganon so many years ago. And I can speculate that the kingdom itself could have moved, as we see the Great Plateau being a huge portion of land with the Temple of Time and other temples for the goddesses themselves. But an indication that the kingdom has been in the same spot all those years is in the tapestry in Imphas house. You see the divine beasts in the corners of the people group that pilot them, and they are all pointed at the center of the map. While this can be convincing for the center of Hyrule, some can say it could be artistic, but then everything seems to escalate from the center of the kingdom regardless. For me, after events of the first calamity, sometime after, the Shikatek was told to be buried and removed from the kingdom. Where in the blazes are you going to hide these things? Well, for starters, when they are all uncovered again, so close to the second calamity, they are all buried, and in a cutscene, we can see Va Naboris is being uncovered in some cliffs. There are some theories, and I think facts of whereabout of the other divine beasts, such as the massive elephant Ruta being submerged in the lake and Rudania being on Death Mountain. Wherever these titans are on Earth, massive chunks of land would have to be moved to conceal them. Since in the cutscene it was the Sheikah excavating them, they must be the only ones with this task, and probably the only ones with the knowledge of their whereabouts. Maybe. But what about the Great Fairy's power during all this time? So my theory is that Mount Nibiru area probably had Naboris, and that path to the Gerudo probably didn't exist, since there's a stable that is set up there, and the Gerudo probably had that closed off with maybe another path that goes up the cold mountains on either side. Shifting waters and time can change things too, with rivers and lakes devouring what was once towns of West Hyrule Field and Tauren Wasteland by Lake Akala. I'm willing to ponder if these trails that we know of were made exclusively by the network of stables. That could be a stretch for some of the names and the places that lead directly to ruins on the trails. I also wonder if the pillars near the castle were force buried by Shikatek, and maybe all of this because they can transport things and teleport things are simply how they buried them or concealed them. Anyways, there's a lot to speculate, and I just want to consider what a kingdom like that might look like. And our best guess is probably going to come up when we look for the next installment of Breath of the Wild, or even seeing some of the footage in Age of Calamity. Here's hoping what we can discover in the next Breath of the Wild game. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please leave a like, comment, or subscribe, and maybe leave a comment of things that I left out, or your own thoughts of how the kingdom could be shifted. There's a whole lot of mystery here, and so it's pretty open-ended of what a kingdom like this could look like. Anyways, I had a whole lot of fun making this video, and I hope to make more of these theories in the future. So, till next time, have a good one, everyone.